Accommodating our seating arrangement here. This is the Wilderness Issues lecture series, this year focused on climate change, moving from science to solutions, sponsored by the Wilderness Institute and the Center for Ethics. My name is Nikki Fear. I'm one of the coordinators of this series. We are having a live interactive video conference with Professor Mary Wood, who will meet soon on the screen here. She is able to see us, and we're going to be able to see her in her presentation materials. This is an experiment for us. As far as we know, this is the very first large public lecture at the University of Montana where this method has been used. I want to give a big thank you to the technology people who went out of their way to make this possible tonight. Scott Christensen from the University of Montana and Jess Yates at the University of Oregon. Thank you very much. Professor Wood is going to be talking to us live from Eugene, where the University of Oregon is. She has in her audience her students tonight, so she's not interrupting her schedule. Her students are natural resource law students. We're going to go for 50 minutes with her talk tonight, and then we'll have questions and answers. Please come up to the mic to ask your question. Throughout the whole session tonight and the Q&A, Mary and her audience here will be able to hear us, so you'll hear how we interact with her as she's speaking tonight. To introduce Mary Wood, I decided that we should bring in a real live lawyer. So we have Tom France here. He is someone who's directing a large national conservation organization that's taking a lead on climate change. He has been directing the National Wildlife Federation's conservation program in the Northern Rockies for the last 20 years. So here's Tom France to introduce Mary Wood.
Thanks, Nikki. This certainly is a first for me, introducing someone 800 miles away, 600 miles away, who I can't see, but I assume she's there. And it really is a pleasure to introduce Mary Wood. She's a very distinguished professor of law at the University of Oregon. Her title is Philip Knight Professor of Law. She's also the Morris Center Resident Scholar and the Lubass Faculty Fellow at the University of Oregon School of Law. I'm not sure any professor at the University of Montana has quite so many titles. She teaches property law, natural resources law, public trust law, federal Indian law, public land law, wildlife law, and hazardous waste law. She is the founding director of the school's environmental and natural resource law program, a faculty leader of the program's Conservation Trust Project, and is the recipient of the University of Oregon's highest teaching award. Professor Wood is the co-author of a leading textbook on natural resources law, and she is currently working on a book entitled Nature's Trust, a legal paradigm for protecting land and natural resources for the future. She's co-authoring another book entitled The Dawn of Planetary Patriotism, a civic manifesto to stop global warming. She's a frequent speaker on global warming issues, has received national and international attention for her sovereign trust approach to climate change policy. Professor Wood's keynote address from this evening will be found tomorrow on her website, and she urged me to provide all of you with a website address so that you could download her materials and the citations to other materials that are in her talk tonight. The website is on the screen, and for those of you listening via radio, you can find it at www.law.uoregon.edu/faculty/Wood. I'm personally very interested to hear Professor Wood's talk tonight. Her scholarship is renowned throughout the West, and the thoughts that she's providing on global warming are sort of the leading edge of how we're dealing with this issue in the United States. So please welcome Mary Wood.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me there? Yes? Can you hear me? Okay. I want to say Tom France has long been a hero of mine, and I've never met him face to face, so I guess the beam introduction is good enough for now. But thank you, Tom, so much for those words you said. And I really want to thank Nikki Fear for setting this up and for providing this technological innovation of beaming a speaker in as part of your lecture series. It's a fabulous series, and I really thank all of you for coming out to it tonight. I also wanted to thank the technical people, including our own Jeff Gent, who's sitting here in the room helping us out on this end. Though we are separated by 657 miles, I found out in a Google search, I think there are two things we all share in common. First, we all like the planet we live on, and second, none of us are very well prepared to live on a different planet. Yet, that is how scientists describe Earth, a different planet, if we don't begin slashing carbon very soon. Mark Linus put it bluntly a few years ago in an article he wrote. He said, if we go on emitting greenhouse gases at anything like the current rate, most of the surface of the globe will be rendered uninhabitable within the lifetimes of most readers of this article. 8 days ago, the mayor of New York City addressed a UN climate conference and said that curbing global warming was just as important as stopping nuclear proliferation and terrorism. As Mayor Bloomberg put it, terrorists kill people, weapons of mass destruction have potential to kill enormous numbers of people, global warming long-term has the potential to kill everybody. The fact we must face is that no one on this planet is going to be unaffected by global warming as time goes on. Our collective future hinges on what we do today. As individuals, we can choose one of two paths. We can either put our heads in the sand and pretend nothing is happening, or we can each find our role in this crisis. Unfortunately, the sheer scope and horror of global warming causes most people to take the first path, living life day to day as if nothing is looming in their future. The purpose of my talk this evening is to bring climate crisis to a conceptual level that ordinary citizens can act on. It is often said throughout history that ordinary people have considered it their responsibility to do something extraordinary. The time we live in calls all of us to do something extraordinary, mobilize a nation to save a planet. I would like to start by describing the urgency we face and our government's colossal failure to address this crisis. I will then turn to a legal principle that I hope can catalyze the kind of paradigm shift we need to confront global heating. And I will leave you all with a call to citizenship that I hope you will deliver to your families, your workplaces, your churches, and your schools. So let's start with a global view of the problem. And I present this picture even though many of you are well informed about global warming. However, even many people who do recognize the problem have not internalized the urgency we face at this point. It's an urgency that puts a premium on literally every single day that passes. Carbon levels in the atmosphere are now higher than they have been for 650,000 years, and every day humanity puts 70 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere. The world's carbon emissions are rising nearly 3 times as fast as they did in the 1990s, increasing by about 3% every year. Once in the atmosphere, carbon persists for 100 to 1,000 years. And so this means generations to come will be trapped under the greenhouse roof of our own making. 6 months ago, leading climate scientists issued a report concluding the Earth is, in their words, in imminent peril. Scientists have said that if we don't curb carbon emissions now, future humanity will live on a, quote, transformed planet. Global heating threatens to destroy all the major planetary fixtures, including the polar ice sheets, Greenland, the coral reefs, and the Amazon forest. As the Washington Post put it, for scientists, global warming is a disaster movie. Its opening scene set at the poles of the Earth. The epic has already started, and it's not fiction. The Earth has already heated 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial average temperatures, and because of the carbon already in the atmosphere, a total 2 degrees Celsius rise is now inevitable. That 2 degrees Celsius rise is what scientists consider to be the threshold of runaway catastrophic heating. Exceeding this would make it warmer on Earth than it has been for 500,000 years, and in the words of one leading scientist, many things could become unstoppable. The United Nations projects that this irrevocable 2 degrees Celsius rise will put up to 30% of the plant and animal species at risk of extinction. Species of all sorts are already migrating towards the poles and seeking higher latitudes in search of cooler temperatures. Coral reefs worldwide are bleaching and dying. Climate heating is driving relentless drought in Australia and the Southwest. It's shrinking the Great Lakes, reservoirs in the West, and Lake Chad in Africa. It's causing severe water shortages in Tibet and Tennessee, floods in Texas and Jakarta, mega fires in California, Greece, and Idaho, and killer hurricanes in New Orleans and Honduras. Mosquito-borne illness is sickening people in high-elevation places that have never seen tropical disease before. In the forests of British Columbia, beetle infestations have killed millions of acres of trees, and U.S. foresters now predict that every mature, large, lodgepole pine forest in Colorado and southern Wyoming will be dead within 5 years. Climate change is delivering heat waves that killed 35,000 people in Europe in 2003 and sent thousands of Americans to cooling centers in 2006-07. It's spiking summer temperatures in Death Valley to 125 degrees Fahrenheit and bringing warm temperatures to New York to the level of 72 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of winter. As one UN scientist put it, 10 years ago we were talking about these impacts affecting our children and grandchildren. Now it is happening to us. Sea levels are rising. The UN has warned nations to prepare for up to a 2-foot sea level rise by century's end. But more recently assembled data shows that the accelerated loss of ice is so great, it outpaces even the most pessimistic UN projections. A year ago, scientists made the stunning prediction that the Arctic would have no more sea ice in the summer by 2040. More recently, they've revised that date to 2012. Last month, the UN's climate panel asked scientists to look at what he called the frightening possibility that the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica could melt rapidly at the same time. Melting of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets would add up to a sea level rise of 10 meters or more. A 10-meter rise would flood about 25% of the U.S. population. If the entire Antarctic ice sheet in Greenland melt, the world faces a potential rise of 80 meters. As climate disaster strikes, people start to move in desperate search of survival resources. The UN has alerted people to prepare for 50 million environmental refugees by 2010. A World Security Report authored by a former head of the CIA, a former chief of staff, a former deputy assistant secretary of defense, and others, describes the scenario of a 2.6 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature by 2040. They say, nations around the world will be overwhelmed by the scale of change. The social consequences range from increased religious fervor to outright chaos. The darkest outlook comes from James Lovelock, long thought of as a prophet of climate science, who predicts by the end of the century, most of Earth's current population of 6.6 billion people will be wiped out, leaving only 500 million hanging on at the far latitudes of the planet. We can only hope he is dead wrong. Many of you might be wondering about the climate skeptics. If you follow their trail, you find most are paid by industry-funded think tanks to spread confusion. The reality is that anyone still in denial probably wants to be in denial. They are best just ignored. For quite some time, the question has not been whether global warming is occurring. The question is whether we can cut our carbon emissions in time to prevent runaway heating. NASA scientist Jim Hansen, widely regarded as the preeminent scientist of our time in global warming, wrote just days ago, "We are on the hairy edge." There's no doubt humanity is already in for some severe climate punishment, but the consequences will be unthinkably worse if we don't slash emissions now. If we continue on our present course, the UN projects a possible temperature rise of 11 degrees Fahrenheit by century's end. We are rapidly slipping towards a climate tripwire, a point of no return that climate scientists call the tipping point. At such a point, our enormous carbon pollution could kick in positive feedbacks in nature that are capable of unraveling the planet's climate system, causing runaway climate heating despite any subsequent carbon reduction achieved by humanity. Scientists have identified several dangerous feedbacks. One is the albedo flip. When ice melts and turns to water, it causes more heating because water absorbs heat and ice reflects heat. So melting begets more melting. Another feedback is the failure of Earth's natural sinks to absorb carbon to compensate for our pollution. The Amazon rainforest is drying and burning, and it is releasing more carbon now than its remaining vegetation can absorb. The oceans are becoming saturated with carbon. In short, these places are on the verge of turning from carbon sink to carbon source. Another feedback results from the vast exposure of permafrost melting in Siberia and Alaska, which can cause huge amounts of carbon and methane to be released to the atmosphere. A scenario described by one science writer as an atmospheric tsunami. These feedbacks all lead us closer to a precipice. Even 2 years it was assumed that we might have 8 to 10 years left before the tipping point. But more recent data shows we are on its doorstep now. To quote a leading study, Earth is perilously close to dramatic climate change that could run out of our control. The UN head of the climate panel recently told the world, "What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. This is the defining moment." 2 to 3 years. That deadline has not registered with Americans. The United States continues to produce nearly 30% of the world's greenhouse gas pollution. Look around, our society is nowhere near decarbonizing. Many people seem happily oblivious to this global catastrophe, perhaps because it seems more like a science fiction movie to them. Indeed, the more serious the environmental issue, the less likely it seems to be taken seriously in the United States of America. So let's review the big picture. We face a problem that is unprecedented in terms of its consequences, a problem caused by virtually everyone on Earth, a problem that to solve requires us to overhaul our sectors and our lifestyles, a problem that requires us to act before nature passes a critical tipping point looming right in front of us. Climate thinkers agree nothing less than a massive global effort surpassing the scale of World War II will provide hope of stabilizing climate at this point. But this is no time to get discouraged. We must save despair for better times. We have tremendous ability to mount an atmospheric defense effort. The biggest limiting force is our imagination to do so. We must remember the great wartime mobilization of World War II. When we hear auto companies today complain that they need 12 years just to come out with higher fuel efficiency, we should remember the auto industry stopped making cars altogether for 3 years and put all of its resources into the production of vehicles. All manufacturing in this country was re-geared towards that war effort. A toy company made compasses. A corset manufacturer made grenade belts. The financial world sold war bonds. States lowered their speed limits to conserve gas. Communities planted victory gardens to grow food locally so that commercial food supplies could be sent to the troops. Consumers made with the bare minimum. Speakers bureaus formed in cities across the country, drawing 100,000 volunteers. These victory speakers, as they were called, were key to mobilize the nation very quickly. They would give 5-minute speeches at theaters, schools, town halls, clubs, any forum they could find to explain the nature of the threat and what citizens could do about it. Victory speakers were not chosen for their outstanding oratory skills, but rather they were the trusted and familiar voices of the community, the banker, the carpenter, the mother, the teacher. People did not just sit by, they took initiative. And their leaders inspired great urgent action. Roosevelt told America, "Let no man say it cannot be done. Speed will save lives. Speed will save this nation which is in peril. Speed will save our civilization. Slowness has never been an American characteristic. Generations later, how is this same country responding to the urgency of climate crisis? The reality today is that most Americans are just too busy to make time for global warming. Look at parents as an example. We are so consumed with taking our children to piano lessons and soccer games that we don't stop to think of how our children will fare in 2040 if we leave them a world of runaway heating, which is characterized by massive natural disasters and scarce food and water supplies. By living out the American dream today, we are essentially signing our own children up for a draft of their lifetimes in an unending war for survival. But this war will be the scariest because it has no end, not even for their descendants. Unfortunately, it's no consolation that we are good, devoted parents who just don't think much about climate crisis. Nature won't consider our children conscientious objectors to climate crisis. To be sure, there are some Americans who are responding with changes in their lives. They ride the bus more often. They don't buy bottled water. They purchase locally grown food. They turn off the lights all the time. And these people are very important models. But national defense cannot be put on the backs of a few good soldiers. Most of these concerned citizens are not doing anything to enlist the rest of society in climate defense. There are very few speakers for climate defense, few victory speakers. Small progress can give us a dangerous sense of security. Climate defense entails carbon math. We lose this war for generations to come if we can't get our planetary carbon load down in time before the tipping point. And each day that passes, our window of opportunity closes that much more. Here is the hopeful part. We have the human imagination, the resources, the legal tools, and the bureaucracy to cut carbon sufficiently. We can do so without harming our citizens. In fact, many of the changes would vastly improve the American quality of life. But this is clearly a task for government. And this is exactly why we have government, to address broad threats to society and organize a response. We have thousands of agencies. In fact, we have more agencies than any other nation on earth. If every one of them made global warming a top priority, we might stand a chance of meeting this challenge head on. But all of our regulatory authority and taxpayer money is now locked up in government. We need those resources to be put immediately in curbing greenhouse gas emissions. In World War II, new commissions and agencies sprang up overnight to amass a huge national defense effort. Looking back at Hurricane Katrina, it was the Pearl Harbor of climate crisis. Yet do you see mayors and city councils and county commissioners and state legislators and the president getting up early and working late to address climate crisis? No, our government is driving our country towards runaway greenhouse gas emissions. County commissioners are approving trophy home subdivisions and destination resorts. State environmental agencies are approving air permits. The Forest Service is approving huge timber sales. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is permitting coal-fired plants and expanding mountaintop coal mining. There presently exists a deep gulf between what we should be doing and what we are doing. But we must remember, in this system of democracy, citizens do hold the levers of government. Government will act if citizens demand it, but our leaders will not act if citizens do not demand them to. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." The heart of the problem is this: Americans seem to have lost their understanding that government is obligated to protect their natural resources. And when the public loses its sense of government responsibility, believe me, government officials quickly lose their sense of responsibility towards the public. There is no better evidence of this than the position taken by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency with respect to climate change. It's the only agency charged by Congress with protecting our atmosphere and air. Yet the agency is spending all of its talent and our taxpayer money to resist protecting the atmosphere. The agency even sent its lawyers all the way up to the Supreme Court in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA to argue that EPA did not have the ability to regulate carbon pollution. The lawyers characterized protection of our atmosphere as a political choice and claimed that the agency has discretion to permit pollution by the automobile industries and the fossil fuel industries, no matter that this legalized pollution threatens to destroy the climate stability that has supported human civilization for 12,000 years. EPA lost that case, but it is still not regulating carbon pollution. In fact, it's doing everything in its power now to prevent the state of California from passing more stringent standards to automobiles. It says if our home is on fire, 20 fire trucks are in the driveway with hoses drawn, and the fire chief claims discretion to sit idle and watch our house burn down. Unless we Americans quickly gain a fierce national sense that our leaders are responsible for protecting our atmosphere, we won't force them to take bold action as necessary. Our leaders will continue to fiddle in Rome while this world is carried beyond the tipping point into a disastrous state of runaway heating. In order to solve the problem, we must understand its cause. How have Americans lost sight of their government's responsibility to protect crucial natural resources? Ironically, the answer lies in an unintended consequence of our environmental laws. In the 1970s, at the height of the environmental movement, Congress passed a set of ambitious environmental statutes, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and many others. And those statutes gave us a tremendous amount of environmental law to control any environmental problem you can possibly think of. The problem is that, along with this authority, these laws also gave discretion to these agencies to issue permits to allow destruction or pollution, precisely the pollution they were designed to prevent. Of course, the permit systems were never intended to subvert the goals of the environmental statutes, but the majority of agencies today now spend nearly all of their resources to permit rather than prohibit environmental destruction. They have used their discretion to enshrine a permit system that inevitably sinks the statutory goals. So whether you're talking about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. EPA or a state water agency or city planning agency, most agencies are not saying no. And now the overarching mindset of most agency officials is that permits are there to be granted. Because this permit system has embraced discretion, society has lapsed into assuming that government must have nearly unbridled discretion to allow destruction of our natural assets. And courts aggravate the problem because they fail to examine whether an agency decision is politicized. They operate on the false assumption that all agency decisions are neutral. This neutrality, of course, is often a charade. Do we really believe, for example, that the former chief of staff of the White House Council of Environmental Quality, who had been a former lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute, do we really believe he was neutral when he edited government climate reports to de-emphasize certainty on climate change? He is now with Exxon. The danger is this. When we relegate climate to the political playing field, there is no umpire. There's just discretion. Citizens find it normal now to have to go lobby government for their own survival. So the public has to find a new frame, in essence, for viewing government's role towards nature. As the author George Lakoff says, reframing is changing the way that the public sees the world. It is changing what counts as common sense. I want to now turn to an ancient yet enduring legal framework designed to hold government accountable. The bedrock principle of this legal framework is that government is a trustee of our natural assets, including the waters, wildlife, and air. A trust is a fundamental type of property ownership whereby one manages property for the benefit of another, just as if you were managing a college account for your niece. We all hold a common property interest in nature's trust. We, along with the future generations, are the beneficiaries of natural endowments, and we need our trust to be productive in order to sustain human survival and promote human welfare. Our imperiled atmosphere is the most crucial asset in that trust. With every trust, there's a core duty of protection. The trustee must defend the trust against injury. Our government trustees do not have unbridled discretion to allow irrevocable damage to our trust. As our Supreme Court said back in 1892, this is a quote, "The state can no more abdicate its trust over property in which the whole people are interested than it can abdicate its police powers in the administration of government." This obligation to protect nature's trust lies at the very heart of government's purpose. A government that fails to protect its natural resources sentences its people to misery. When we call upon government to defend our atmosphere, we are invoking principles that are ingrained in sovereignty itself. These principles are said to exist from the inception of humankind. Well, in this country, nature's trust principles were penned by judges long ago as the first environmental law of this nation. And the trust principles underlie all of our modern environmental statutes. We can take that same set of environmental law and, without changing a word of those statutes, reframe government's role with respect to nature. By reframing, we can turn the government's discretion to allow destruction of our atmosphere into an obligation to protect our atmosphere. Looking back in the history of our country, reframing was essential to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and FDR's New Deal. When we portray nature as a trust, we vest citizens with lasting expectations to an enduring and bounded property asset. Pollution of that air becomes an infringement on American property. The failure to mount a national climate defense is as absurd a proposition as America sitting idle during an attack on American soil. But the principle works in reverse as well. You hear about all the climate legislation out there that's being proposed. Well, we can pass any new law we want. And as long as those laws are pressed through the discretion frame, government will continue to impoverish our natural resources until society can no longer sustain itself. So let's now look at how the trust principle finds reinforcement in the economic and moral realms, because a true social paradigm shift cannot be limited to the law alone. In economic terms, nature's trust finds tremendous synergy with a principle called natural capitalism, which is a fundamental rethinking in economics that requires businesses to build profits by using the earth's interest rather than as capital. When you all read about wind power growing 25% in 1 year alone, that represents a piece of industrial capitalism converting over to natural capitalism. Of course, if wind, tidal, geothermal, and solar continue to grow so much, they will snuff out a huge part of the fossil fuel industry. As well they should. After all, the heart of American capitalism is economic innovation. Old dinosaurs and dirty industries should die to make way for new green industries that don't deplete or destroy the capital that we rely on. Climate scientists have made it clear that humanity cannot release to the atmosphere all or even most of the remaining CO2 fossil fuel. In their words, to do so would guarantee dramatic climate change, yielding a different planet than the one which civilization developed on. When we invoke natural capitalism, for the first time ever, we design our economic structure to harmonize with government's timeless duty to protect the assets in our trust. And in moral terms, nature's trust characterizes the natural assets as part of the endowment that future generations are entitled to inherit just as we inherited them. Failure to protect natural inheritance amounts to generational theft. The duty towards future generations is a moral imperative that speaks universally to all cultures, all ages, all classes. This obligation springs from the heart of all humanity. And so it is really this law, not some arcane provision of the Clean Air Act, that brings hope of uniting citizens of the world together in mounting an atmospheric defense effort. Within this trust framework, I would now like to switch and offer 3 concrete principles to direct government's climate response. The first principle is that the laws of nature, not politics, must define the necessary action. Scientists have used climate modeling to present us with a path that they believe will keep us on the safe side of the tipping point. To achieve that 2 degree Celsius limit, you remember I told you the 2 degree Celsius limit is the threshold of runaway heating. To achieve that limit, we have to keep atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide below, and maybe well below, 450 parts per million. It may be much lower than that. We are now at 383 parts per million. So we can think of this as the climate imperative. You see, this is really a matter of carbon math. We must realize that if various political measures do not add up to the necessary reduction in time, they will be futile. A rescue rope that is too short is no good at all. The second principle builds on the first. Trustees have specific fiduciary duties that serve as standards of performance for managing the assets. You see, we don't just vest trustees with priceless assets and then have no accountability. If you have $1 million in a retirement account or a college account, you wouldn't just say to your trustee, maybe a bank, just get whatever interest you want on it, 15% or 2%, or even just give it away, I'll just take whatever's left. And you certainly wouldn't have that approach with assets that are fundamental to your survival. The trustee has to measure up to a fiduciary standard of care. Well, the next question is, what is the fiduciary care for managing the atmosphere? In September 2007, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a report that had emissions targets for stabilizing the climate. This is a clear quantitative prescription for action to get our planet back on the path of climate equilibrium. And it is therefore a yardstick for government's obligation as trustee. There are 3 things the U.S. must do. The first is vastly most important right now today, and that is arrest the growth of greenhouse gas emissions within 2 years. Second, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4% thereafter a year. And third, ultimately bring the emissions down 80% by 2050. The deadline to arrest the growth of emissions by 2010 is directly in line with the call by the United Nations to arrest planetary carbon emissions by 2015. You see, the international planetary deadline is set out 5 years ahead because it will take countries like China and India more time to arrest their growth of emissions. The third principle has to do with the responsibility of each nation and each state within each nation to reduce carbon. The sovereign nations on Earth share the atmosphere as their common asset. Some people wonder, well, what about China? What about India? This is a framework we can apply to those countries. They are sovereign co-tenant trustees of the atmosphere, and they're all bound by the same duties and obligations that would control, for example, the relationship of family members who own a summer cabin together. Each co-tenant has the duty not to waste or destroy the common asset. Property law has always imposed this duty on co-tenants. Well, you can apply this mandate to every nation of the world and create a framework for carbon responsibility. You can imagine and stick with me here, you can imagine the industrialized world's planetary carbon load as one big pie. You've heard of pie in the sky. This is it. Even though industrialized nations come in different sizes, if each reduces proportionately its slice of the carbon pie will reduce by that amount. But the contrary is also true. If any industrialized nation does not reduce its share of the pie, the carbon pie will not reduce by the amount it needs to. That nation will leave what we call an orphan share that will sink all other planetary efforts. The U.S. is responsible for 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. No other nation on Earth is positioned, much less obligated, to adopt an orphan share left by a deadbeat sovereign, especially as one as big as ours. So this third principle means that as co-tenant trustees of the atmosphere, all industrialized nations must carry out their share of carbon reduction as set forth in the prescription that scientists have given us, those targets I talked about earlier. Now, scaling down to another level, this also means that all states, including Montana and Oregon, and all cities, including Missoula and Eugene, and all counties within all states, must carry their burden. It is their fiduciary obligation as trustee. In order to save this planet, we cannot excuse any orphan shares. I recently gave a talk a couple months ago to a class of high school students in McCall, Idaho. And I told them, and they were all just in front of me, big-eyed, and I said, the fate of the entire planet rests on McCall, Idaho. Because if you don't take your share of carbon reduction, who will? Do you expect those of us in Eugene to take it? We've got enough problem with our own shares. And unless every share is accounted for, we are not going to decrease the carbon pie in the time we need to. Well, that point hit home with those students. There was a sober moment when those students realized that their future depended on their town taking carbon responsibility and on everyone else on Earth thinking the same way. We must look reality in the eye now and ask what it will take to arrest the growth of emissions within 2 years. That's a very short time frame. And yet, the hopeful aspect of a society built upon waste is that we can make some major cuts without compromising any basic needs. We have the legal tools available to arrest the growth of emissions. A carbon tax is probably the easiest, swiftest, most effective way to stop new sources of carbon emissions and bring existing sources down. But also necessary is a moratorium against new coal-fired plants in this country. NASA scientist Jim Hansen recently gave testimony in an Iowa coal-fired plant proceeding in which he said that one more coal-fired plant with emissions of nearly 6 million tons of CO2 per year for 50 years could, in his words, be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We are that close. In addition to curbing emissions, it is important to protect all of the remaining natural resources that we still have. We have to safeguard any remaining carbon sinks that have the capacity to absorb our carbon pollution. That means a halt to extractive forestry, wetlands destruction, and industrial farming that injures soils. Moreover, we have to now look at all of our natural resources in a different light because they are now much more valuable functioning in their natural way than used for singular profit. Due to the heating already in the pipeline I talked about earlier, society is not going to have all of the forests, the waters, the wetlands, and the productive soils that past generations left us. In the new world of climate heating, all remaining natural resources carry a premium. Society must now treat nature as if it were more important to our survival than our pocketbooks. And if we can't quickly learn to do that, we have very little hope for our future. We must also start thinking and acting like beneficiaries in order to hold our government trustees accountable. We must demand government trustees to undertake and make public to us carbon accountings that disclose the results of these climate initiatives I've mentioned. Carbon accountants are now able to measure the carbon emissions of any jurisdiction, which means that they can track progress in how a government is bringing down carbon over time and whether or not they're actually meeting that 4% incremental reduction every year. Without such a carbon accounting, we would have to simply trust that our trustee is doing his job, and no smart beneficiary does that. As citizens, we are entitled to an accounting of our atmospheric asset, just as you would be entitled to a quarterly statement issued from your bank for a monetary asset. Nevertheless, I'll bet many of you are thinking, it's not politically feasible to stop timber sales, stop sprawling development, and cut back on motorized recreation or pleasure driving. And you're quite right. The only politically feasible course of action is to send this world into disaster. Now go look a child in the eye and tell him that. That is why we need courageous leaders to voice a new political paradigm, one that offers hope to the coming generation. But many elected officials make policy out of fear rather than courage. They fear that their constituents will resent the changes that may cut into their lifestyle. And that is exactly backwards. Today's life of convenience is locking us into a life where there is no convenience. Where is the convenience of a family huddled on a rooftop praying that a helicopter will arrive to lift them out of the floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina? And where is the convenience of 500,000 Californians evacuating their homes to escape wildfire rushing towards them? Do we find convenience in the 13-year-old boy who was washed down a flooded creek to his death in the torrential rains of Texas? We have to take action now to preserve any semblance of the security and predictability that we now take for granted. And those concerned about the impact to private property rights have to now confront the reality that all private property depends on natural infrastructure. When that infrastructure collapses, it causes natural disasters that make property borders irrelevant. Remember, private property deeds didn't account for much in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and it won't account for much along coastlines with rising sea levels either. The choice for government is now disaster prevention or disaster relief. This is a chance for politicians to become true leaders, to explain clearly the nature of the threat to the citizens and the need for short-term investment and regulation to provide long-term security. True leaders know how to do that, and all other leaders must quickly learn how. But we can't walk bravely into this new world without a moral compass to guide our decisions on a day-to-day basis. In World War II, there was a high community moral standard backing all of the individual sacrifices. You wouldn't have seen SUVs roaring down the streets of America while people were trying to conserve gas for the troops. Any waste on the home front was considered a direct affront to the families that had sent their sons into war. Americans really understood the connection between the need to conserve and the welfare of their sons in defense of our nation. Today we need to recognize that same connection between our waste and the welfare of our sons and daughters. We have to realign our consumption choices along needs versus wants, simplicity versus extravagance. It is time to ask whether bottled water is more useful for high school vending machines than disaster relief packages, and whether a Hummer is really needed for an office commute. Given what the scientists say, the real hidden subsidy of today's life of consumption is human death and misery tomorrow. We are freewheeling over future graves. Barbara Kingsolver speaks of the anguish of standing behind a child, looking with her at the road ahead. She writes, "The truth is so horrific, we are marching ourselves to the maw of our own extinction. In the end, the destiny of our children comes down to actions taken by each one of us individually and all of us collectively. Yes, the problem is big. Yes, it seems insurmountable. But is it too big for you? Should you just turn away from it?" Kingsolver says, "I do know the answer to that one. That's called child abuse. When my teenager worries that her generation won't be able to fix this problem, I have to admit to her that it won't be up to her generation. It's up to mine. This is a now or never kind of project." And you know, she's right. It's now or never collapsed into just 2 years to arrest the growth of carbon emissions. Americans must wake up to the reality and hold government responsible for protecting our future. Democracy simply doesn't work without citizenship. There are many people in this country, perhaps even the majority, who are concerned about global warming yet are doing nothing to hold their leaders responsible for solving this problem. They are not deniers. They are simply distracted. When these citizens are confronted with the truth of what is happening, they will feel a moral obligation to act, and they will then force their leaders to act. This is a psychological leap forward happening all over the world at once. But it doesn't happen without catalysts. Let me tell you, in the closing part of this talk, let me tell you about one fairly young catalyst. I mentioned speaking to schools in McCall, Idaho, elementary and high school schools in McCall. And McCall is a small mountain town of about 3,000 people, and it's supported by a fairly big tourism industry and logging, mining, and grazing industry as well. And until recently, it was a town that did not have concern for global warming, even though it's experienced some strange ice melt in the winter, wildfire in the summer, and doses of West Nile virus. After I spoke to those McCall high school students and elementary school students, a 10-year-old girl named Claire, who I knew, approached me with a letter she had written to her community. It was addressed to the people of McCall. She wrote it after she and her family watched a movie called Planet in Peril, which I imagine many of you have also seen. It's a movie that documents the collapse of ecosystems worldwide, and that movie had left her so upset and disturbed about her future that she decided to write a letter. If I had left town without doing something about that letter, it just would have haunted me. So I told Claire we would get together a group of people, adults, over pizza, and talk about these issues. And I invited about 20 people, half of whom I didn't even know. And also invited Peter and Sam, who were two high school students that I'd spoken to in that high school class. And after everybody arrived to fill their plates, Claire got up in front of this group of adults and Peter and Sam, and she read her letter. And I have a special guest with me tonight, a 10-year-old boy named Sage from a Eugene elementary school, who is going to take my place at the podium and read just a few lines of Claire's letter.
Dear people of McCall, I'm really disappointed not only in what America is doing, but what the whole world is doing. Coral reefs are dying, forests are becoming farms, icebergs are melting into the ocean. That is only the start. All the world is getting in trouble. We can make a difference, though. We can make a difference if we just spend time with family and friends, talking over what we can do and proceed to do what we talk about doing.
We can make a difference. Thank you, Sage. 3 weeks after that letter was read, Peter and Sam, those high school students, along with the adults at that pizza gathering, packed the high school gymnasium with hundreds of people from the town of McCall to give a presentation on global warming and how it would affect their future. And there were nurses and doctors and parents and grandparents and coaches and accountants and architects. The entire town seemed to show up. And the event began with Claire reading her letter. And there were tears, because the townspeople knew this was real. But now there's no stopping that town and the changes they will make. With Claire and the community behind her, she has managed to get a whole town to take responsibility for carbon pollution. And that town is taking a leap of faith that every town in the world will do the same thing. 10-year-old Claire is a victory speaker. In World War II, it took 100,000 victory speakers to mobilize a nation in a very short time. We need victory speakers for climate crisis. We need ordinary people who can talk about the urgency of the situation and inspire extraordinary action. Climate victory speakers are emerging from all walks of life. A young woman named Allison Rogers, a Harvard student, put on a swimsuit to bring attention for global warming, and she entered the Miss America beauty pageant. A British lawyer put on a swimsuit for global warming too, but he dove into waters at the North Pole, waters that 30 years prior had been 11 feet of ice. And author Bill McKibben organized an entire day across the nation of Step It Up rallies. Lori David wrote a book. Sheryl Crow did a college tour. Evan Goodstein, who will visit your lecture series later on this month, I think, he did a whole Focus the Nation event involving thousands of schools. Your own University of Montana, Nikki Fear, rode over 1,000 miles on a bicycle as part of a Ride for Climate to educate people about global warming. A huge number of forces in Nevada fighting coal-fired plants. A 9-year-old boy and his 7-year-old brother in Eugene, Oregon planted a victory garden to bring free local vegetables to their neighborhood. And a 9-year-old boy in Australia has waged a campaign on YouTube with a stump speech that goes, "So this election, remember, it's your vote, but our future." The world today needs such can-do people, and we need millions of them. We don't need any more can't-do people, the passive bystanders to climate crisis. When their grandchildren demand to know why they did so little at this crucial time, the can't-do people will say, "I don't know, I didn't have the time, we couldn't control China's emissions, no one else was doing anything, I had too much going on, I couldn't have made a difference." These responses will be ashes in the wind. The can-do people will save this planet, and they will tell their grandchildren how they answered the call of a generational mission. So whatever your position is in life, know that this is the time to do something, do anything. Just don't do nothing. If you are a teacher, bring global warming to the classroom. If you are a parent, bring it to the PTA. If you're a lawyer, bring it to court. And if you're a banker, bring it to the bank. Somehow, fate has delivered all of us into this pivotal moment on Earth at this time. We did not live 100 years ago when it was too early to even imagine the collapse upon us. And we will not live 100 years from now when it will be too late to save what we still can. This is our moment. But if we Americans take the lead through all these walks of life, we can reframe what is currently government's discretion to destroy our atmosphere into an obligation to protect our atmosphere. We need to treat our atmosphere, finally, as a commonly held asset in the endowment that we must pass down to future generations for their survival. And if we succeed in defining that one obligation on the part of our government, we may soon find every other nation in the world united with us, not against us, in a massive, urgent defense effort to secure the systems of life on Earth for generations to come. And that will be the dawn when victory speakers all over the world will know that they used their moment on Earth to ignite a planetary patriotism. So I thank you very much, and I hope I'm now looking at a room full of victory speakers.
Thank you, Professor Wood. And please, if you have questions, come down to the mic. Either mic works. And I believe if there are questions in your audience with your students, we would welcome those as well. So get those minds thinking as well.
Thank you for your presentation and all your good words. Have you thought about arming your victory speaker with a class action suit that we could bring as a country in the legal system?
Is this Tom France?
It is not.
I still don't know what Tom France looks like. Okay. Yes, I have. I have developed a litigation map for a theory I call atmospheric trust litigation. And a chapter I've just completed is on my website, which was on the slide behind me. And anybody's free to download it. That atmospheric trust litigation basically takes the principles I've given and puts them in a litigation roadmap whereby citizens can sue under common law their governments, any level of government, state, federal, or even county or city, for the failure to meet their fiduciary obligation to control carbon emissions. And so what it would do is take that fiduciary standard of care that the Union of Concerned Scientists defined for us and make that enforceable through a carbon accounting and through individual plans to reduce carbon. And those would be enforceable through court. Now, this is not the only way, perhaps, to attack global warming in the courts, but it is the only macro way that I have seen. In other words, other lawsuits are focusing on very, very small, discrete provisions of environmental statutes. All of the litigation over the Clean Air Act, for example, will not bear fruit in time to arrest emissions within 2 years. So I do advocate lawyers across this country thinking in a different way and getting together and bringing a set of lawsuits, perhaps 8 to 10 on the very same day with the very same press package, to hold government accountable for its fiduciary obligation to protect our atmosphere. And for more details, feel free to consult that chapter. And I'm also writing a longer law review on that right now that should be out within a month, at least in draft form.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tom. Certainly, the National Wildlife Federation is made global warming its top priority. We've been hard at it in a very practical way, I think, for the last several years. And it's been an interesting journey. And I'll tell you where I am tonight, and I'd be interested in your reaction. We have focused our resources on the Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act. It has some flaws. I wonder about the basic cap and trade approach, but that's where we are, and that's where the practical politics say we need to be if we're going to get the country moving in the right direction. Whether it's fast enough, we can debate, but it would be an enormous step forward from where we've been if we could pass that legislation. I've been on my own political journey in this, and over the last several days, I previously sort of been thinking, I'm going to vote for Obama or I'm going to vote for Hillary. And I think they're both powerful leaders and they both have much to be said for them. But lately I've been rethinking that and wondering about John McCain as the political leader who has defined global warming as one of the issues for our times. And he is also the political leader that can, I think, bring the country together in a way that a Democratic president can't. And I find that almost heretical for me to be thinking that way. But as I think about the issue and its importance, he's the one that has defined it as one of his signature issues. I don't agree with his politics on many other things, but I think, as you correctly pointed out, we're at a crisis, and we need a leader that is going to say we're at a crisis. And he may be the man that is best able to do that. And so I'll just throw that to you as a practical question to think about tonight.
Well, I think you've defined it. The leader, the next president, has to be the one to define this as a global issue. I rather think that this is a political opportunity that even all three are missing, McCain included, in that a president could be not only a wartime president without the war, we're talking about a defense effort here, but could also lead the entire world into a new planetary existence, so to speak. We're going to have global warming, and the next president can make their mark on history in a way that no other president or leader ever has. So I do think they're all missing this opportunity. If they realize the political capital involved in confronting the crisis and speaking truth to the matter in a way that citizens can understand, they have the chance of unifying an entire country and walking away easily with an election, because every citizen cares about their own survival and their children's survival. So I think it's a matter of framing the issue.
Hi. Thank you very much for being here and doing this for us today. My question is regarding the victory speakers you were talking about earlier. Do you believe we've already got enough people in the global warming movement to make a change, comparable to something like the Civil Rights Movement or World War II? Or do you think we still need to get more people on board and keep hitting this like it's really going to make a change tomorrow rather than 20 years from now?
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't have given this talk tonight if I didn't want every one of you sitting in every one of those chairs to think about becoming a victory speaker. We need every single person we can get. This is a national and global environmental defense effort, and we are nowhere near getting the amount of citizens on board that we need. So the only mechanism I have thought of that would be quick is to use the victory speaker model to get other citizens on board. And I tell you, the effort is contagious, because once someone makes change in their communities, they are naturally a leader. They inspire more confidence, more people join, and every innovation in every local community now, because of the internet and email capacity, kind of replicates itself many different ways across the entire globe. If a city is banning plastic bags in the United States, you will find a city in China doing that and a city in Australia doing that. So every innovation now has the capacity to spread so globally, so quickly, that I think we victory speakers must think of ourselves as not only catalysts on the local level, but truly on the planetary level. And I think this will take off. It must take off.
Professor Wood, as someone that's been involved with the court system for longer than I care to remember, one of the things that I have learned is that the court process is extremely slow, and it takes years to get any case through the federal court system now. And I guess I'm wondering, in terms of your sort of call to legal action, where kind of in your heart of hearts do you think that fits in an overall strategy, not just to educate the public, but to actually effectuate change?
Well, that's a very good question. And you notice that I characterize the Nature's Trust approach as a legal, political, economic, and moral frame for this problem. Because I don't think that the courts, you would never want to put all your eggs in one basket. And the courts are very slow. So this is the one characterization of government's obligation that I think does resonate across all of these other realms as well, and can be pursued in various realms. In fact, I just published an article not long ago in a magazine that goes to 8,000 nuns across the world, Catholic nuns, talking about the moral basis of Nature's Trust. And people are doing conferences now on natural capitalism, which is very synergetic with Nature's Trust. So I think it is the only legal theory perhaps compatible on so many different levels. I will say, however, the courts, if pressed, can do much more than they are willing to do today. I have seen courts in treaty cases arrive at injunctions allocating fisheries responsibilities before fish move up a river. I mean, if the judges are pressed, they know their role in this, which they clearly don't yet, but if they were to come to that realization, I do believe that they could issue injunctive relief in fairly short order, and that itself would set a precedent that would inspire at least political action. But I would be the last one to say, drop all the other efforts and run to court.
Hi, I want to thank you for your speech, and I was very interested throughout how you framed your words and your argument as a means of rhetoric and rhetorically. And I noticed throughout there's a simultaneous kind of appeal to the imagination, and as well as kind of a war rhetoric and a defense model that you're proposing. And in light of all the war that's kind of going on right now in the world, and how we're solving that problem with a war kind of model as defense, I was just wondering if how you frame it in that model would be threatening based on fear-based policy as opposed to a policy of hope that you were talking about, and if you could speak a little bit more to what it means to define this as a war defense rhetoric.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the time has come to probably acknowledge that the efforts in the environmental movement have failed. We haven't used the right discourse to appeal to a broad variety of people. The defense analogy, it's not so much a war, it's war language, but it's a defense effort, which is different than an attack, of course. I think it's very powerful for people to remember back to virtually the only time in our modern history when so many people in the nation united together, and that was World War II. There is a feeling of patriotism, of sacrifice, of connection between our consumption and waste and the lives of our sons and daughters. So I think there's a lot of value there. The appeal of a defense rhetoric is that you catch people into the loop that may not be receptive to sort of love the earth language. There's a lot of people out there in Eugene, Oregon that you would want to speak to in different terms, but we have to start appealing to people that haven't listened before. And so I think when you characterize this as a defense effort, that you pull every single nation on earth into the same effort, and you do inspire this patriotism that you really can't using an appeal to perhaps other grounds. So I hope that makes some sense to you. It is not the only rhetoric you could use. People often say, and I think with great validity, this crisis is going to be solved not with a silver bullet, but with silver buckshot. So you can just consider this one of the buckshot. And there you go. There again, there's the word out there. But anyway, that wasn't my expression.
Can we take a question from someone in your audience?
Oh, they're not prepared for questions.
I wasn't ready.
Okay, we have one question.
I was going to say. So the Kyoto Protocol.
Do you want to come up here? Why don't you come up here, Jeff? All right, we've got our student coming up here so you can see him. This is Jeff.
Hi. I'm taller than Professor Wood. So I've been kind of spoiled by hanging out here in an environmental program at the law school, where I hear this rhetoric a lot, and which is great. It's very inspiring. But what bothers me is the Kyoto Protocol is asking the United States to shave 7%, which to my mind is like a very small number. Really a small number. That doesn't take a whole lot to shave 10% off of whatever you want, your budget, your whatever. And I'm having a hard time understanding why that's a challenge. And I'm also having a hard time understanding why it's, even around here, I'm not seeing any change in just people's day-to-day activities. Weird thing for me is personally is this building, the law school that I'm in, every light in this building is on 24 hours a day. Outside, beautiful sunny day, there's lights everywhere. I'm still not seeing people just doing all of those little things that add up to 7% really quick. And I guess I'm wondering how we get people to just do all those little teeny tiny things that will actually get us there with no effort. I really don't see it. 7% to me is a small number. And I'm trying to understand why that's so hard to get there.
Yeah. Okay, let me, I'm down. I have a theory about this. It all comes down to why aren't people taking individual responsibility? And it's the classic free rider problem, which is obvious to all of you. But that is why I focus on orphan shares. And that's why I told those McCall students, The whole fate of the world rests on McCall, Idaho, decreasing their carbon emissions. And they looked at me at first like I was crazy because McCall is only a town of 3,000. But once we look at this as a pie, and we determine that a pie is comprised of nations, that each nation is comprised of states or cities, that each city is comprised of people, we come to realize that we can't have orphan shares even on the individual level. So we have to somehow quantify the atmosphere and create bounds around it. It's a bounded asset. It's not just air out there somewhere. It is a bounded, quantifiable asset that we all share. And the best term to use, I think, is as property. Now, the property framework may not appeal to some of you, but it will appeal to other people who are very interested in property rights. When you quantify the atmosphere as a property asset, you realize that every person that partakes of that asset also has a duty to protect that asset. So I think the key is orphan shares, and the other key is we've got to elevate the language to acknowledge the reality today. Our consumption is going to be causing death. And I hate to say it, and until about 2 months ago, I didn't say it. I was talking about habitability on Earth. I was talking about threats to survival, threat to civilization, using all the terms that everybody else uses. Now people are starting to talk about death. Because the fact is that that is where we are going. Maybe not every single person on Earth, but there will be so much death from lack of water, lack of food, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, sea levels, violence, that's really the end in sight unless we change our patterns. So I think we have to do two things. The orphan share has to be explicit, so nobody's a free rider. And second, we have to start recharacterizing what's on the line. And those scientific reports, they have it underlying the language, but they don't really come out, many of them, and say exactly what is on the line. I think we have to do that.
Hi. Kind of to go along with that question, you've talked a lot about our personal and our political responsibilities, and I was just wondering if you have any other suggestions for us to take action, both as college students and as a community and as student groups, or what you think, anything out of the ordinary that we haven't heard before, maybe.
Well, that's great. Because you are college students, my answer to you all would be different from, say, a different type of group. My normal response is find whatever you're good at and do it for global warming. So, I know a person who's great at fiddling. I've told him he should be fiddling on the steps of the legislature with a sign that says, "You're fiddling while Rome burns." Or if you are a nurse, you should be eliminating plastic waste throughout your office and figuring out a way that you can export that to other doctors' offices throughout the country. But because you are college students, I really advise the macro approach. I think we're only going to solve this problem if we get the message out that every city and every state has to meet those targets that the scientists have given us. So I would actually make it a project to go out to jurisdictions at the state level or the city level and say, what is your plan to meet these targets? And we'll help you meet them, and we'll be the carbon accountants that will police you. In other words, we need carbon accountants to go out to every city in Montana, every city in Oregon, every city in every state in the country now, and start monitoring compliance with these targets. So because you are college students, this is the wave of the future. This is happening across industry. We've got corporations now trying to be carbon neutral using carbon accountants. We've got methodologies for measuring carbon, but this hasn't penetrated the entire government sector because we citizens have not been acting as citizens and certainly haven't been acting as beneficiaries. So that would be the class project. Go out and figure out a way to track carbon reduction in cities and states. And then do it. And then replicate it. And then maybe create a degree in carbon accounting. I think U of O is going to race you for that one.
Professor Wood, I have a very practical question. I think a lot of people will probably be intimidated by the prospect of being a victory speaker. But your presentation tonight, of all the presentations I've heard on global warming, is probably the most compelling. So my question is, do you have DVDs, or are you on DVD, or do you have any organization that's putting out CDs or DVDs of you so that people can host functions in their living room and invite people? Because I think that's probably the single most important thing to do.
I have to laugh. Your question got a shocked response from my students. So. Well, let me make 2 points, and thank you for that, the nice things you said, too. The first point is, I tried to give examples of victory speakers that were not just Al Gore or Sheryl Crow, although, you toss them in, too, but of 10-year-old Claire, and here you have Sage sitting right beside us, and the nurses in Nevada. So it really takes, a victory speaker is anybody who's just doing anything to get citizens on board. But the second question is very practical. And yes, I make everything available on my website for citizens to use. And I have no idea, and probably there's a way of tracking visits to websites, and I don't know how to do that, but everything on my website is available for you to download and pass along. You could put it in emails to people. I've got some people have published at the Montana Environmental Information Center over there, published a speech I did and put it on their website and sent it around to a lot of people. Well, that speech got over to Australia, and this was back in the summer, and some Australian guy over there who's active in climate crisis made an Australian version and published it over there, and with very little help from me. So you are free to take anything from my website. That is exactly why I put it up, and just take it wherever you want. I'll try to get well, Jeff is sitting here trying to get a podcast of tonight's lecture so that we can get the podcast up, and people in Eugene want that podcast too. So look for that on the website either in a few days, or if we have to rely on the other mechanisms, it'd be a few weeks, I think. So I'm at your disposal. I'm trying to get the word out, and if you if you want to publish anything I write in some newsletter, just call me up and you can do it. So please use those materials. I try to make them accessible to the public in terms of the simplicity of the message, too.
Thanks, Professor Wood. We have one more question, then I have a final comment, and that will be it for tonight.
Okay. First of all, Professor Wood, thanks so much for giving us all your info today and taking your time. This is not so much of a question as it is University of Montana students, if you feel like you want to do something that affects your campus right now, right here, Thursday at 11:30 in the UC, the Sustainable Initiatives team is going to be meeting. I don't know the building, I don't know the room number, but come check it out. We've got all sorts of stuff, different projects, internships, volunteer opportunities for people who don't have time for projects and internships. And we're going to be doing stuff with recycling, lighting audits, and stuff that actually applies to campus that you can take part in. So, Professor Wood, thank you again, and have a good night.
Thank you. And I think with all these initiatives, it's just important to keep in mind the very big picture and create a role for yourself that is the biggest possible. That's what I would advise. It will be the most fulfilling possible, too.
We actually do have one more question right here.
Thank you. I really applaud the idea of the planet and different nations having to come together to address this problem, each doing their own share of this. I'm curious if you would have some explicit suggestions on how to make that happen across different governments around the globe, where you have industrialized nations like China that are often very repressive and maybe aren't interested primarily in protecting, the rights and ensuring the future of individual people, as well as governments like our own that operate with the fundamental understanding, of our constitutional framework that these transnational corporations have rights as individuals under the law. I'm wondering what some explicit maybe solutions that you would have for tackling those sort of inherent problems, I think, with a lot of government, so we can really tackle this thing.
Okay, well, that was a great question. With respect to our own country, I do still believe we have the thread of democracy and that we can exert it if we use those levers we have. So we need to change the framework. Again, I can't emphasize enough. The American public is asleep in this crisis, and it is assuming that government's taking care of the atmosphere. So even though it sounds a little bit anti-environmental to say that the statutes aren't working, I think we have to go out and say, government, you are trustees of this asset, we're the beneficiaries, you need to manage the asset to protect it for us. So changing the frame of our discourse and then getting out there in every city meeting, every agency meeting, state legislature, and activating citizens in the way that we really haven't seen for a long, long time in this country. I do have hope that this country could quickly turn things around if citizens would only wake up to this problem. As for China, that's a lot more difficult, of course. But even China, I have a team of Chinese, it's a small team, but I'm publishing a law review article over in China. And so I've worked with a small team of Chinese people over there, including Chinese lawyers and somebody who's fairly high up in the Environmental Agency of China. And the number one thing I'm told in every conversation with Chinese people is, America's not doing anything, so why do they expect us to do something? So if we get control quickly of our own government, which I agree it's a real challenge with the multinationals, but if we get control of our own government, I do think that China will not have that argument anymore. And then you can say, well, that was just an argument. There's nothing to compel them to do anything. But I think in China there is a culture of honor that may not even exist in our government anymore, but may exist over there a bit. And so I think there is something intangible about them stepping up to their share, but they've got to see us do it as well. So China is taking a lot of initiatives that we don't know about, and the last thing I would want to see is every one of us getting discouraged thinking that China's doing nothing. In fact, a lot of things are happening in China right now. It's happening so fast, we're not communicating to each other all the progress being made. So that was a great question. And I've got some articles on my website that deal with international frameworks if you're interested.
Thank you, Professor Wood. Let's give her a round of applause tonight.